Listen to a contemporary paraphrasing of Psalm 23 by Francis McNabb. Generous giver of all things, in your presence my inner spirit is fully satisfied. I know I share in the abundance of life. I can lie down without fear. I can sit beside the stillness of the river. I find my soul is strengthened. I know there are right paths. You will guide me to them. I know I must face the shadows of life and meet my death. I will do so with courage. I know there is an unseen presence with me that gives me comfort and strength. Generous giver, along with all the uncertainties and threats of life, you provide me with good gifts. When I have enough, you pour into my life something more. Indeed, my cup overflows. May I find and give goodness and kindness every day of my life. Let my life be a constant expression of my desire to reflect your good presence wherever I am, wherever I go, wherever, forever. For the transforming freedom of the Spirit of Christ, we give thanks.
Listen for words of encouragement in the Gospel of St. John, chapter 10. The time came for Hanukkah, the feast of dedication in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple area in Solomon's porch when the temple authorities surrounded him and said, "How long are you going to keep us in suspense? If you really are the Messiah, tell us plainly." Jesus replied, "I did tell you, but you don't believe. The work I do in my God's name gives witness in my favour, but you don't believe because you're not my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never be lost. No one will ever snatch them from my hand. God, who gave them to me, is greater than anyone, and no one can steal them from God. For God and I are one." For the word that was in the beginning, the word that invites and inspires us, for the word embodied in us, we give thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Morning, everyone at home, and those who watch the YouTube, if you do. Throughout history, humanity faces wintry terrains, dark times. Where is a divine source of life in these times? For the people in the ancient Near East, the notion of shepherding, divine and human, was one way of imaging a way of being together as people and being a way of people of faith. Ancient Israel, for those of us who have read the scriptures, moved between stable, and I guess you could say when they were in Egypt that was a stable community, although it became unstable, didn't it? Nomadic, semi-nomadic forms, pastoral forms of social, economic, political and religious experience. Shepherding during the winters of Israel's ancient pastoral history. First, though, we need to liberate shepherding from our middle-class, individualistic, normative Western interpretations of shepherding. We need to attempt to access what we call the world behind the text. We read the text, but what is the world behind the text? Psalm 23, a shepherding psalm, is the best known of psalms. It expresses powerful images of Yahweh's unseen yet companioning presence within life, especially the wintriest moments. But this image is more than the individual, personal, pastoral care that we can slide into when we think of shepherding. As Vladimir reminds us, shepherding was a big metaphor which could encompass the vision of the reign of Yahweh, with the full range of political, social, and personal dimensions which that entails. And he continues, it is much bigger than pastoral care, understood often in a very limited sense, without these wider dimensions. And also, and maybe some of you know this, and I hope through the years of our listening to this, Shepherding Sunday over and over and over, if I repeat myself, may you meditate on the fact that you know what I'm saying, what I'm sharing. So it is suggested, and for me this was an awareness, it is suggested that the primary historical event that informed Psalm 23 was probably the Exodus and wilderness experience. So that's what it is, as a big picture, not just a personal one. The time when Israel remembered and celebrated Yahweh's protection, Yahweh's care, and the construction of the new guidelines for living together. So this psalm is a big psalm. It celebrates the triumph of light over darkness, the shepherding nature of God, and symbolises freedom from oppression that societies can create and limit our own being. It embraces the personal, the communal, the structural, and addresses the reality of colonisation, which we still experience in this country, and the presence of ongoing liberation. This is a really, really radical text if we really consider what it is. Howard Wallace, Hebrew Scriptures scholar, is he still around? Teaching, but certainly I lean to him for the following insights, and which I'll briefly share with you about the psalm, and of course that the reading from Francis McNabb I think touched at least that personal element deeply. Psalm 23 is often interpreted to be about death, but it is about the journey of life, and as those of us here know, it's dealing with the death in life challenges which we face. Yahweh as a shepherd wields power for the good of the whole life of the people, to sustain, to guide, to protect, and to open new ways of being. A key role was to provide sufficient nourishment for personal and collective life, including food and water. This shepherd is also responsible for the personal and collective self-confidence of the flock. To restore the soul, and for those of you who know a bit of Hebrew, the Hebrew word is nephesh, and it means more life and vitality. It means to restore life and vitality. Yet just a word on restoration, because we can slip in the fact that restoration it can be returning to an idyllic past, and some of us, especially in America, want to go back to an idyllic normative past. We won't go there. Restoration suggests change, empowerment, accompaniment on the right pathways, to right our ways of justice and compassion. The notion to walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil, relates more to our, everyday, regular human trials and tribulations of life, including physical dangers, illness, and grief. And in verse 5, when Yahweh sets a table before us, and I've heard, I think Jolyon has mentioned this a little bit, it'll come out as I speak, Jolyon. Yahweh is imaged as a gracious and generous host who expresses continuous goodness, divine mercy, and of course, again, the Hebrew word hesed, which means kindness, solidarity, loyalty. As we heard last week in John 21, even in times of failure and shame, Jesus represents the God who forgives, loves, deals with our shame, and encourages us to go forward. Shepherding in John 10, Jesus, the transgressive door, voice, and activity of the authentic shepherd. We can see now in John 10, if you read the whole chapter, not just in the section that we had read, it is influenced by Psalm 23 in the big picture of things, as I've suggested. But John deepens the notion of divine and human shepherding through the story of Jesus, which shapes our shepherding. John's Jesus radicalises the notion of being shepherd. It does this by adding images, new images, to even Psalm 23. Jesus being the door, that the followers of Jesus hear his voice, and that he is the authentic good shepherd whose commitment to humanity involves even giving of life, of dying for us. But it's not there at that point of just dying, and then empowered by the divine source of life to create new, abundant life. This demonstrates the length to which Jesus and the parent God would go to ensure humanity will experience abundant life. To briefly summarise, at least this point, not the whole thing, John fuses historical elements with parables, a bit here and a bit there, allegorical interpretations, to add new depth to the story of Jesus, to reveal the new radical relationship humanity experiences with the risen, crucified Christ and the divine source of life. And especially, the story of Jesus and his compassionate and liberative engagement with the poor and the excluded, of his desire to lead us out of blindness and illusions, as in chapter 9, which our society constructs, and in some ways we could say I'm not to blame for the way society constructs a constricted view of life, but we are to blame because we need to see and look. So this engagement with those pushed to the margins creates ambiguity in the notion of shepherding, a normative understanding and a transgressive one. And in fact, the choice that I believe the historical Jesus, you can see in this text if you delve enough, between all the other things, that the choice that the historical Jesus made to use the image of shepherd was to imagine his engagement with outsiders was probably a transgressive and offensive one. And by that I mean not just to be a rebel. Jackson Brown's wonderful song, Rebel Jesus. Did anybody remember that? Just as an aside? No, nobody? Jackson Brown fan? Is that a hand? Is that a hand? I should play it one day. So it's transgressive and offensive because it challenges the way society is ordered and faith is set out, that has some people in and then leaves some people out. It was transgressive to some Jewish leaders, so I do not want this to be anti-Semitic, transgressive to some Jewish leaders who ran and organised society in a particular way, who defended the social and religious order of that community, even with its exclusions. That's why they kept challenging the practice and teaching of Jesus, as we see, the notion in John, the whole of John, the Jews. It's this particular group. Shepherds were often outsiders, those whose marginalisation forced them to the edges of that ordered society. And often transgressive behaviour is forced by society. Literally, they were forced beyond the gates of the city and often accused of grazing their flocks in green pastures they did not actually own, and that was deemed to be transgressive. So for Jesus to describe himself as the authentic shepherd, because that word good is not agathos, but kalos, it's authentic. Jesus describes himself as the authentic shepherd, was probably to critique traditional patterns of exclusionary power and authority. For a marginalised, alienated people, the Good Shepherd points towards an alternative source of power and a door into a new way of being together. Women in Israel, in ancient Israel, can anybody name women shepherds in ancient Israel? Surely. No? Rachel? There were women shepherds in ancient Israel, just as a note. And in John's Christian communities at the turn of the first century in Ephesus, where we believe it was written, there would have been women who were accepted as leaders and shepherds, which would have challenged the patriarchal power relations of Jewish communities, because post-70 rabbinical Judaism shifted where people actually were closer together, and then Christians had to actually defend themselves a bit better. My third point, if you haven't been noting the points, shepherding during the winters of Israel's ancient pastoral history. In John 10:22, John writes, "It is winter." During winter, Israel celebrated the festival of dedication, Hanukkah. It was a time to give thanks and remember Yahweh's presence, care, and liberatory intervention during the past wintry terrains of Israel's history. Hanukkah originated out of the dark time in Jewish history, when in 175 BCE, Syrian king Antiochus planned to colonise all the land from Syria to Egypt, which included Judea. The Jewish people resisted him, but he found, and this is interesting, he found support among segments of the Jewish aristocracy and priesthood. Antiochus desecrated the temple, ordered the Jews to abandon the Torah, publicly to worship Greek gods, colonised their society, culture and faith. People were persecuted and people were killed. In 164 BCE, Judas Maccabeus led a successful revolt against the Syrian forces. The temple was rebuilt and refurbished, and it was rededicated. So, implicitly, in this very historical experience, in that period of Israel's dark times, there was a dual shepherding going on. The shepherding of Yahweh working unseen within history, and the shepherding of leaders and their liberating activity like Judas Maccabeus. A story, fourthly. How do we experience and engage in ethical, authentic, and transformative shepherding in the winter of our lives? Rabbi Harold Kushner, who has sadly passed from us, author of When Bad Things Happen to Good People, shared an interview that Psalm 22 is an answer to the question, how do you live in dangerous, unpredictable, frightening world? a tearful moment from a Ukrainian Russian. What inspired him to write his book was the death of his son, who was 14 years old and was born with an incurable illness. He shared, "Where did we find the strength and the ability to raise him, to comfort him when he was sick and scared, and ultimately to lose him? And the only answer is," he continues, "when we used up all our own strength and love and faith, there really is a God, and God replenishes your love and your strength and your faith." In his rabbinical dialectical fashion, and it's so beautiful, he shared that the divine life inspired not just pious affirmation to trust, but inspired us to be truly empowered, he says, to be shepherds, to shepherd and care for others, which started in the family. On the one hand, he said, the role of God is not to explain and not to justify, but to comfort, to find people where they are living in darkness, take them by the hand and show them how to find their way into the sunlight again. And then on the other hand, he says, to deal with why people get stuck and guilty, and in this way, empowered by faith, he deals with self, the inner life and anxieties of people in despair and resignation. So I hope that I'm moving into the end, I hope that you've sensed in what this witness is saying, that we can never separate theology, the divine source of life at work in our life and in our struggles, theology, psychology, or for me, psychoanalysis, who we are in our complexity. I guess you could add family systems to that, and structural systems, and politics. Politics being the ways we construct society for the good of all, equality and justice, and I guess also how we can actually challenge when it becomes normalised. Sister Joan Chittister, a Benedictine nun and social psychologist, remarked, the role of real religion, well, I would say she means faith, but the role of real faith is to bring us to an awareness of life, to transform the world, to come to see the world as God sees the world, and to bring it as close to the vision of God as we possibly can. And why, she asks? It's very clear in Scripture, well, at least to her. What God changes through us, through you and me. It is dialectical, it is partnership. And as Paul Lehmann, a student of Paul Tillich, writes in his book, The Transfiguration of Politics, we witness the larger mysterious acts of the divine source of life in transfiguration events in human lives, in cultures, in societies and nations. Wherever, he says, this transfiguration occurs wherever human life is made more human. Events of liberation, of freedom, the transvaluation of values. The things that are not transform the things that are. And to conclude, our faith holds that the divine source of life is the beyond in our midst, is the mystery and the unseen. Yet in this mystery and unseenness, moving in and between us in ways only revealed as we make human life more human, inclusive and liberative. John's Jesus uses the shepherd imagery to inform our faith, to inform our practice of the intimate, mutual relationship that humanity, that you and I, that we can experience with the divine source of life and through the radical story of Jesus.